Okay, our last presentation is about sustainability. And for this presentation, we have Dr. Neil Hausman from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's a senior program officer, and he contributes to the agricultural development goal of de-risking and validating new technologies with the potential to improve the livelihoods of small-scale producers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. He has a background in geology and quantitative genetics and plant physiology. And prior to joining the Gates Foundation, he served as an R&D director and Corteva Distinguished Fellow at Corteva Agriscience. And he also worked at DuPont Pioneer. And we also have Dr. Keith Kressman from the UN FAO. He's a senior locust forecasting officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And as FAO's top desert locust expert, he has been operating in the organization's Global Desert Locust Monitoring and Early Warning System and has been providing forecasts to countries for the past 35 years. In addition, he has established innovative early warning systems for other transboundary pests such as fall armyworm and red palm weevil. And prior to FAO, he worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in plant protection in Tunisia and with USDA, APHIS, ARS on cotton pests in Phoenix, Arizona. And we don't have slides for this panel. We are just going to have a conversation. So with that, I will open it up to the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Calista. Neil, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off with a brief definition in my mind of what sustainability means in this context. To follow on the great presentation about the value of communication, clear communication, I find defining terms is a good way to begin honest and open communication. So in this case, just thinking through anything that we develop, it's important that it has an impact and it has value for people. But of course, sometimes if you have a product or a service that has a positive impact, but then disappears, especially if it disappears after a short period, then the overall effect could be negative because you come to rely on the service, it's part of your life, and then it disappears, and oftentimes you don't have access to the previous, the way you used to do things. And so you can be worse off, even if it had a short-term benefit. So we need to think really carefully about how we develop goods and services, and to make sure that they don't just have a short-term benefit, but can also have a view to the future, so that that benefit is reliable and can become part of a useful system for helping and for that smallholder farmers can rely upon in the long term. And that's a very difficult part, and often an overlooked part of what we do in the international development, where many times projects end, money disappears, funders start thinking about other problems or other emergencies arise, and we forget about the valuable solutions that have already been delivered. And so that's something that we pay a lot of attention to, and it's not an easy or simple piece of what we do. So maybe I'll ask Keith, from your perspective, what does sustainability look like from your position?
I think, Neil, part of this thinking process that you're just talking about, it obviously starts right at the very beginning of the whole kind of development process. And I think it involves asking ourselves, the people who are, trying to develop, something new, a number of different questions. First of all, whatever we're trying to do, is it solving a problem, a real problem out there? And I think that's very important because often we start down the development track, but then we sometimes lose track of what we're doing. And we need to come back to that very basic question, what problem are we trying to solve? Are we developing an app because, there's an absence of data that is needed for planning purposes, let's say. Another, I think, really important question is who is going to benefit from, whatever is being developed? If we just continue with the example of, let's say, an app or a tool, who's going to use it? Who's going to benefit from it? If you're asking people to use it, why should they use it? Because obviously there has to be something in it for them. I mean, after the novelty wears off, they'll probably stop using it. So there has to be a really good kind of benefit for the user to use the tool, but obviously to benefit others as well. So who else is going to benefit from that app, let's say? In terms of the development process itself, I mean, obviously the Gates Foundation or FAO, we're not, app developers. So we have to partner with somebody to do that work. So we need to really partner with a good entity. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. And it's a bit of a trial and error process. We go through, some developers that they're not so good. We eventually reach ones that are good. But I think it's really important to have that necessary funding that's flexible, to allow us sometimes to shift in midstream. We might start with one developer, but then we might have to, shift to a completely different developer if we're not happy with that progress. And then I suppose the last question is really important as well is, how do we continue it? And this comes directly to the issue of sustainability. How is all of this work, this development work, the app, if we use that example, the use of the app, how is that all going to continue in the future? And if we struggle to answer any of those questions, those four basic questions, then we need to kind of go back to the drawing board at the very beginning and kind of question ourselves as to what we're doing and how we might need to kind of modify that whole approach.
And I agree completely, especially around the piece around who the user, defining very, very clearly who's going to use it and what benefit they'll derive, because that describes why it exists, right? And if you develop something that doesn't really meet those why criteria, then it won't have any, it may never have any benefit, right? It will be thrown out there with a hope that lots of people will come, and it could be off the mark. For example, it's like having a beautiful cell phone that doesn't connect to any of the cell phone towers that are around you. It, in theory, is a wonderful tool, but in practice, it can't do anything or doesn't meet its minimum need. So understanding that who's going to use it for what purpose, and then staying in touch with that throughout the development process. So if you need to start, as you said, with the idea of thinking through these things very carefully, but then staying in touch with those end users as you develop it, as you deploy it, and then those needs change as well. As you said, if you collect data, then it may be a time where you have enough data and you can move on. In other cases, the data, the situation is always changing, and you need up-to-date data. And then but the data needs may change because, of course, especially with climate change, nothing is reliable. And so staying in touch with the customer from beginning, middle, end, and continuing, and really listening to them as they say what their needs are, what their problems are, and not pushing ourselves on or thinking from our own perspective, here's what I think they need, and moving ahead too rapidly on that part. So being able to pause, listen, ask questions with humility is a big part of developing solutions that have the potential for sustainability.
I have maybe one example to kind of share with everyone on maybe kind of a how we learn from a failure. So rather than always, painting everything rosy, let me start with one that was a bit more challenging. And this was the fall armyworm. If you remember, it invaded Africa and, about 5 years ago, and then it spread throughout the continent and over to Asia. And at that time, there was kind of the general perception that we needed to have a monitoring system and we needed to have some type of data collection in the field. And so I remember going to West Africa and to Central Africa and East Africa, to a number of countries, to meet with the farmers and to the people that were being affected by the fall armyworm or were concerned about it, to ask them their needs and what they wanted. And that was a really positive start. It's kind of grassroots. You get the people involved from the very beginning. So kind of textbook perfect, let's say. And then we went off to develop the app. And we kept the kind of the farmers and the communities involved, and we produced an app. And then the next step, which is the hardest step, is to disseminate that app and to get people to use the app, throughout the African countries. And it wasn't just a few countries; it was now several dozen countries or more. And we failed. So despite really kind of textbook perfect rosy beginning, we failed. And when we started to kind of investigate, why was that? We realized, in fact, that first of all, as Neil mentioned with the smartphone, it wasn't very well targeted. Who was going to be the user? Was it farmers? Was it communities? Was it a community focal person? Was it a plant protection officer? Was it an extension agent? Was it an NGO? We thought we'd just kind of develop an app and throw it out there and thought people would use it. And obviously it didn't work that way. The second point was that, okay, the app collected data, but then no one thought what they're going to do with that data. And okay, yeah, they're going to put it into a database and put it into a GIS like everybody does and make nice maps. So actually, but how are they going to use that data? For what purposes? What decisions are going to be based on that data? We fell over on that one. In fact, we didn't really kind of research that out in advance or think about that or discuss it with the decision makers. So in the end, we ended up with an app, we ended up with a platform, a little bit of data being collected, but nobody really using it and nobody taking kind of any ownership of any of that. And when you have, all of those kind of elements, then you do have a recipe for, something not, really succeeding.
Sure. And I think that goes back to an important area of incentives. So yes, people can use the app to collect data, but what would motivate them to do so? They're unlikely to just collect data on fall armyworm for fun or because they can. And so you need to think and understand why people would even download the app, why they would use it, and why they would continue to use it. And what is that motivation? Sometimes they're paid to do it, but even then, if it's, if you don't understand the local motivation and what other things they have to do, or, the competing priorities, then you may never get the use that you expect. And then I'll bring up the obvious, but the topic that we haven't mentioned, which is money, which is everything, and for anything to be sustainable, it means that some good or service, it needs to continue into the future. And we all hopefully have salaries that can support us and our families. Those need to be continued. And so we need to think carefully about where is the money coming from? And in almost all the cases, it's very hard, especially in a smallholder farmer context, to expect the smallholder farmer to bear that cost, just given the margins on their businesses. So we have to think and involve other players who do have the money that will continue these projects. And in all reality, even a multilateral institution like the FAO or a huge philanthropy like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, things change. And, we are as unreliable in many cases, or even more so than other players. And so thinking through carefully, how is this going to continue? Who will fund it? Who will pay for it? And build it with that in mind, parallel to understanding customer needs.
I think you're right, Neil. I mean, that's absolutely critical, especially if the tool, let's say, has operational costs associated with it, not just development costs that might be covered under kind of a project, one-off project. But, again, coming back to data collection in the field for locusts, I mean, and that's critical, the timeliness of that data collection. So, it needs to be real time or near real time. And often in the middle of the desert, there's no network or cell connection. So we have to rely on satellite data transmission, but there's a cost involved in that. So, every bit of data you send, you have to pay for. And so we developed what we call the eLocus 3 tool some years ago. And we realized this from the beginning. We're going to have to figure out a sustainable way to pay for the operational costs. And it's not something that a country can be expected to pay for, because governments change, budgets change, priorities change, and we would not want to, find ourselves suddenly one year one country doesn't have any more money to pay for it. So inside FAO, we have regional locust commissions, and they have member countries, and so each of those member countries, they pay annual contributions every year. So we thought, okay, we could fund obviously the cost of the satellite data transmission from these commission trust funds, basically, and then FAO is paying the associated costs, and that's worked very well. Initially, the countries were reluctant because prior to that, they didn't have to pay for any data transmission. I mean, it was all free. They're writing it on a piece of paper, and eventually it gets to you 2 weeks later. There's no cost there. But when you want real-time satellite data, there is a cost. Once they got over that hurdle and they understood the value of having data in real time and that there is a cost to it, it was accepted. And that has proven to be a very sustainable approach. But now as we shift from that satellite-based data transmission back to kind of cell network database transmission using smartphones. And, we've been working with Penn State University on developing the eLocus 3M kind of smartphone app. There's no longer, of course, the cost for the satellite, but there is the cost to the user in terms of using credit from his or her mobile phone. And these are much smaller costs. Maybe on the level of $10 or $15 a month, but still that can block the usage if somebody doesn't have that amount of money in his or her pocket or is unwilling to spend it. So we found in Ethiopia that we had to find other funds either at the FAO level or in the commission or in the government level to provide users with whatever $10 a month of credit that they could then use for sending locus data, and all of that can be monitored. So if the user is not spending the credit, then adjustments can be made. But these type of kind of very operational aspects really have to be considered at the beginning of any type of development project.
One of the challenges there is that many times you can't foresee all of the myriad costs, changes, requirements. And so when you start a project and all, as you said, with the fall armyworm, you've thought of everything except for a key criteria that will actually kill the project. So that's a very difficult part about the whole project planning here, especially when developing software, which can move very quickly, but you need to be very, very careful in how you're doing it and how you're accounting for it. And, as we've already talked about, defining the user, defining the value. One other aspect of developing software is there's always a run and maintain cost. So you can develop the best app in the world, the beautiful thing, you've paid for it, but there will be bugs, there will be new users, there'll be challenges, and there's storage of the data, there's storage of images, there's processing costs, and those need to be worked in. Many cases, you have a software development team, they build an app, they want to move on to the next thing, and the organization wants them to. But one person is kind of left behind having to maintain the old apps. And after a while, that builds up. And so thinking carefully about how you do effectively run and maintain, and also retire things that maybe have value but don't have huge use. It's a careful balancing act between building new things and supporting existing activities, especially when you're successful.
And it comes back to, the word that you started with, Neil, money, always. And it's always depends on, having some flexibility in the funding. And sometimes, FAO internal funds are not very flexible, difficult for them to, account for some of the things they're saying. But then, we partner with a donor that, is flexible, and that understands kind of, these type of needs. And often it's a partnership, it's a cost sharing. So don't expect an external partner or donor to fund the entire thing. There might be cost sharing between FAO and the external partner, even between the countries and FAO and the partner, kind of a tripartite. But yeah, we have to be, I think, as you mentioned, extremely kind of flexible, especially in terms of software development, to keep things updated, to retire things that, are no longer needed or a bit obsolete. And yeah, that takes quite a bit of effort, I think.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect is also around not building 15 different solutions for the same problem. And because each one will not be sustainable, but if you could build 3 even, the total amount of money that is available could support those, both the development of and the support of those. And that takes people putting down their own priorities, their own work, and prioritizing, coming together and building something together. So I think, and that's hard. It's really hard to get alignment, but often what drives sustainability is agreeing to do things once and well. And even if it's not ideal for your situation, to be able to align towards it. It's hard.
I think it's also having the right kind of institutional structure available, because too often, we'll have, let's say, one app we've developed, and then we'll go off to make another app, but then it's tendered, there's a tendering process, and it goes out to a completely different developer who is, let's say, not involved in the development of the first app. So basically then that second app is developed from scratch, and it's not, kind of making use of even code or other processes that are already existing. But if you have the right atmosphere, and here maybe I'd refer to the Innovation Lab, is a kind of a great example of this, where it brings in different kind of developers, but under a single umbrella, that then they can utilize let's say developments that have been made for one app can be utilized in other apps. So it reduces exactly what kind of you're mentioning, Neil.
Perhaps I could just jump in here and ask a question and sort of bring it to the issue that Neil raised of salary. And it's also relevant to the Innovation Lab broadly. So there were 285 people registered for this meeting, and there's now over 300, and currently we have 174 online. 78% of them are from Africa. They're from 26 countries overall across the world, with 78%. And we've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in development over the last 20 years. And for 5 years in a row, we've seen declining food security, so increasing insecurity. And this year we'll see it again. We've seen the World Food Program chief at Davos yesterday talking about all these problems again and again and again. And just on first principles, isn't it a good idea, if we're trying to be sustainable, to sort of take a page out of the private sector's book. And I know, Neil, you came from this. And private sector is brutal. They try to cut costs as much as possible, and they try to measure the effect of everything they do. And that is not the case for public institutions, neither are universities, the innovation labs. I mean, we do try and have metrics and measure things, but we're not brutal like the private sector. But 78% of the people are from Africa on this call, and the price of them is much cheaper. It's like 1/10 the price of a Chinese worker, and it's, for us with the Dream Team, it's between $10 a day to $20 a day, with the cost of data plans, etc. So there's 160 people on the Dream Team across 8 countries now, and we want to have a 10x increase and then a 10x increase, so to get to 16,000 at least before we make it. And then we'd have supercomputer powered young people who are spending 5 days of their week in front of farmers, making a difference. That's meaningful. And the price of them, 160 people, is about 4.3 consultants at the top level rate at USAID or World Bank or FAO, etc., which is about $650 a day. So just on first principles, shouldn't we move in that direction where we try to be very cost effective and also perhaps a little bit more truthful in what we're spending money on? At PlantVillage, we really believe in insourcing and not outsourcing. So a lot of what we do globally has been outsourcing African research to European or American universities. And we're just running this whole USAID project just based upon the Dream Team in Kenya, for example, or Burkina Faso. And the last 2 years of COVID have really shown us that the benefit is enormous from being able to do that, because none of us were able to go there. And this was a great lesson we had from working with Keith at FAO. So I guess the main question is, as we move to desire of being sustainable, just your comments on the shift in the system change we've seen in terms of focusing on cost-effective, cheap young people on the continent, and now bringing them to somewhat parity, not as good as Keith with his 30 years of experience, but helping people to get up to high levels by using the supercomputers which are connected to satellites in their hands. So just some comments.
Again, I can jump in. Coming from industry, I can attest to the brutality and the difficulty, but the drive to make hard decisions all the time. And it's, and I rose the concept of retiring apps. That's a very kind of light one, but still it was hard. We had to cut off users who wanted to use the app and say, this is too expensive and you're not gonna have access to it anymore. And here's the replacement. It may not meet your needs exactly as the other one did, but good luck. I was also involved in almost annual cost-cutting exercises. It became almost a routine, and it was very hard and it was very draining. That said, it was very necessary to change course and to be always in touch with reality and agile in responding to reality, and what are the needs of the day, and how do we move forward in the fastest, leanest way to make impact. And that's, I agree, and I'm sure you've seen it, not really part of our DNA at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're very metrics driven, but there's one of the things I've seen here, without a strong competitive environment, there's less of a drive for operational excellence and efficiency. And I try to bring that in a daily way to my team and to what I do. And, in some ways, it's kind of what Keith started with, which is, who is the customer? What is the value? If this project has no more value, stop it. If this project can't describe its value at the beginning, don't start it. And it's hard. And they're hard conversations. They put people out of their comfort zone, but they should, because, given the needs, given the challenges that we're up against, I, as a person at the Gates Foundation, cannot be comfortable. It's not fair, and it's not right. So I should always challenge myself and challenge others to stretch myself, and it's hard. And the problem is that everyone wants to be comfortable. no one likes to be challenged. And definitely people don't want to go through a restructuring and lose their jobs. So, but it is necessary from time to time in the right way. And as you said, we need to think very critically about, if we hire this overpaid consultant, what value are they really bringing? If we're developing this app that we think is really cool, but we actually don't have a good customer in mind, why the hell are we doing it? So it's I keep saying it's hard, but it is necessary, but it's also important to have a really open dialogue about this. I think it's a very well raised point, and something that I think a lot about and need to think more on.
We have a related question from the audience I would like to pose to you too. How do we relate sustainability with exit strategy of a development project?
Keith, you want to get into exit strategy?
In my mind, I don't really see projects exiting. I mean, okay, structurally or financially, it might exit, but the work of the project, the objectives of the project, the outputs of the project, if it's sustainable, it continues. So, I mean, maybe I look at it from a little bit different perspective. I don't like to start things and then I'm going to have to completely exit them in terms of, so I don't really have an exit strategy. Let's say my exit strategy, if to define one, would be to ensure full sustainability. So if we're developing an app, for example, then it needs to be sustainable in terms of what Neil has mentioned in terms of keeping it up to date and modern, and all of kind of the back end structure is present to provide that service. But the front end, the user, it's the beneficiary who then should assume ownership, and I think that's very critical. When we have projects that then have a development phase and a project phase, and then that ends because of the work ends or the funding ends. At that point, somebody has to still own that project, because if not, then it just disappears. And in my mind, the most natural owner is the beneficiary, which is usually the government of a country or countries. We have struggled, though, in some of our projects to even obtain that ownership during the project life, and then you start to question, and as Neil says, challenge people in terms of the fundamentals of that project. Are they solid and sound, or maybe they're not?
Yeah, and I see exit strategy really in two lights. One is what Keith was just describing as a handover, or sharing with the deployment partner, someone who's going to take it further and wants to either build a business case or pay for it through government funds. And so that's an exit strategy for us, where philanthropy no longer has or at least Bill and Melinda Gates money no longer has a role. And sometimes our partner could be FAO, that's going to take this, that's going to continue the work where we no longer need to fund it. So that exit strategy is kind of a handoff where we exit, but the project doesn't. And then secondarily, an exit strategy can be ending a project, where either there's no more need, or their initial perceived need doesn't exist, or there's no way to get the money to fund it. And we need to plan that exit and the turning off the lights of that project in a graceful way that doesn't have immediate negative impact, and communicate it very well. So back to the last presentations around being very open and transparent about why we fund things in the first place, what value we perceive, and then as we end things, why we're ending them, and what we're moving on to. So to make that decision making open, and to also make it with all the stakeholders in mind, so that we're not just taking independent decisions on our own that have negative ramifications.
Okay, thank you very much. Martin, you had wanted to speak in the Q&A. Please go ahead.
Yes, I had a question, and it's largely what has been talked about here. And if you look at missions projects within the agricultural space, the end game is, food security. And of course, we have other things like wealth, nutrition, but the end game is largely food security. So the question is, if you look at return per dollar, new versus old projects, when is it best, where is it best to invest your money? I've seen, and agriculture is very dynamic. There are situations where, if, for example, you are developing new seed variety, these are projects that can take even 10 years for you to just get viable results. And you have a donor project that probably is going to run for 4 years or 3 years. So most donor projects are time bound. So how one do we marry, align project funding vis-a-vis the reality in agricultural space? And then to when for example, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, how do you strategize or align your projects such that even if you're funding new projects, they kind of build onto already results or achievement or successful story that we've had in the past project? Because as much as we talk about sustainability in this space where we anticipate that sustainability is moving a project towards commercialization or a private sector, the target users of majority of technology, be it digital technology or physical technology, like new seeds, require some sort of capacity or resources. And therefore, the target user sometimes may not be able to quickly adapt to this, depending on how the project was successful in the implementation stage. So, aligning a project towards sustainability and looking at new versus existing or old projects is very crucial. But I'm just curious to know, how do you do this so that as much as new players come into the industry, you kind of build on the successful story that you had moving forward?
Yeah, and Martin, it seems like you spoke very eloquently, a very eloquent question. You probably could answer it better than I can, but I'll make a start from my perspective. And sometimes we overdo this at the foundation. We do a lot of analysis, a lot of strategic planning around what we do and what we shouldn't do. So something we refer to as our comparative advantage. So there's places where philanthropy shouldn't enter, where we don't have any specific value in joining, where other players already exist. There's already a vibrant ecosystem of businesses and governments already providing the services, or we can't do anything different or better. And so we don't enter things, even if it's important, if it's already being addressed. For example, provision of traditional pesticides. There's whole industries that provide pesticides for known pests and diseases. We're not going to build a factory and start a pesticide business. It makes no sense. Even if there's supply chain issues, maybe not our role. So really understanding our role plus the need it is really critical in how we make decisions of where to enter. And then, as you brought up in a very eloquent way, we need to work with businesses. We need to work with commercial partners in the commercial ecosystem to make sure that money keeps flowing. Like the value is there, and so we connect and prioritize projects where we do feel that there is a commercial off-ramp. There's someone who wants to build a business around this or can build a business around it, and that then means that we can de-risk. We can take away some of the risk, bring some partners together that may not have existed before, show what's technically capable, or what's something that can be done, and then plan really intensively to no longer be there and to allow businesses to step up, take up the opportunity, and we can leave and go focus on de-risking other and kind of shining light on other opportunities. And so we have what we refer to as deployment partners. We try to identify them very early in projects, and we try to make sure that we and they understand the value of what we're doing as even very early in the project, so that we can build that together and make this handoff to a deployment partner smooth and fast. And something that we've been focusing a lot on recently is also on what we call proximate partners. So try to make sure that we're not just working with multinationals based in Switzerland, because often they don't, the sustainability of that approach isn't going to be very strong either. And so we need to find companies with boots on the ground, local companies who can build and sustain a model by being close to their customers and understanding the challenges that exist in country. And that's, that we understand is really important to viability and sustainability of our project. It's also hard, and it's very hard to do here from Seattle, Washington. And so we're building that muscle. I'd say we've done it so in the past. We need to do it better as we think towards sustainability.
Okay, thank you guys so much. I think we're at the end of our time together. Again, we have some questions that we haven't been able to get to, but I trust that we'll get those answered and sent out to the rest of the participants. So that concludes our 3-day course, and I would like to say some thank yous. So I would like to say thank you to our interpreters, Yvette and Patricia and Marie, Ida, and Rokaya. And I would also like to say thank you to our A&R event services, so Renee, Betsy, and Jennifer, and to all of our speakers and the Innovation Lab team, and of course to all of you, the participants. Thank you so much for showing up and being very interactive and asking your questions and really participating and taking the time for this course. And so with that, I think David would like to say a few words, so I will hand it over to him. Thank you.
Yeah, well, firstly, I wanted to again thank Callista, as we've done every day for these 3 days, for just being absolutely amazing in organizing this and herding cats beforehand and doing just a phenomenal job of putting the program together and getting everybody here. Obviously, Renee, Betsy, and Jennifer have provided extraordinary assistance. So thank you all so very much indeed. And also to Kareem at Michigan State University for his leadership. The greatest thanks, and of course, to our translators, thank you very much. The greatest thanks, of course, goes to all the participants. This is a project management course designed for those people who normally don't get a look in and don't get access to the money. Those people in what are called NAROs, national organizations of research in the Feed the Future countries. And we really want to enable you all to be able to effectively compete for the funds from the USAID Innovation Labs, both our own one, but also others, because we truly, truly believe in this model of insourcing. And we believe that the time is correct in order to do that. In my question to Neil, I mentioned the impressive stats of over 300 people from 26 countries. And across these 3 days, what we've seen is just an incredibly interesting dialogue and chat among these individuals on a variety of channels, either in the chat box here, the questions they've asked, but also in the WhatsApp channel we've set up. And this is really just a starting point. We wanted to provide a broad overview of how to apply for money, effectively write proposals, manage those proposals, and then think about sustainability. But we will develop on from this and asynchronously add to this content. And our ability to do that depends upon the requests that we get from you. So let's absolutely keep this conversation going. I think it's really so inspiring to see so many people in the room and I'm really impressed by this phrase, particularly because we're focused on Africa, but it also applies to our dream teams in Central America and Asia. But particularly for Africa, the president of the African Development Bank, Akin Adesina, talks about that African youth are not the future, they're the present. And I think all of what we've heard from these presentations and discussions is really a reinforcement of that. So it has been really wonderful. Thank you so very much. And let's make sure we continue this conversation. Thank you to everybody involved on the Penn State team, across all of our partners in the Innovation Lab, the Michigan State team, and others. And we really did appreciate spending these 3 days with you, and we'll be back together very soon. So thank you very much. And let's all recognize that it's also Africa Day, which is this is a phenomenal group of people to be celebrating that day with. So thank you all so very much indeed. Bye.